to try and figure out what might have happened here. In full disclosure, I never thought they would ever find Donald Eugene Webb.
Good morning, Tim. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Chris, happy to be here.
So, Tim, you've been all over the story for a long time. Of course, you've made a career in some respects out of covering organized crime. Donald Webb, he was a Patriarch associate, missing or on the run for 37 years after killing a police officer in Pennsylvania. And it turns out he was hiding right under everyone's nose, literally under the nose of his wife for the last decade or two as he was buried in the backyard. What are your thoughts on Donald Webb, thoughts on this case, and thoughts on Lillian Webb's story?
Yeah, I mean, what a stunning case and how it's unfolded in the last 3 weeks. It has just been a complete shock. I think, and it's made national news when it turned out this fugitive was buried, as you point out, in the backyard of that North Dartmouth home. I'll be honest with you, Chris, when we started looking again at this cold case back in January of 2016, we did a series of reports on it. I was really shaking down some of my organized crime sources to try and figure out what might have happened here. In full disclosure, I never thought they would ever find Donald Eugene Webb. Just it didn't stop me from doing the story, obviously, but I was very pessimistic that after, at that point it had been 35, 36 years of being on the run and the age at which Donald Eugene Webb would be, there was just no way it was going to happen. So when we pulled up to the house, what is it now, Chris, 3 weeks ago, right, to find, an army of law enforcement there, and literally watching an FBI agent that I had interviewed shove a shovel into the ground, it was absolutely stunning. As to your question on Lillian Webb, that is technically the ex-wife of Donald Eugene Webb. She divorced him under the auspices of desertion, which we now know is a lie. In, I believe it was 2005. She contends she acted alone. She put Donald Eugene Webb's body in a large Tupperware bin to drag him across the lawn and then dump it in a hole that she had dug. I interviewed the widow of the slain police chief, Gregory Adams, this week, and we're going to air the story coming up on Thursday on Channel 12, starting at 5 o'clock in 2 installments. I also interviewed Chief Adams' son, who was 8 months old. She said what I think a lot of people believe, and that is she has doubts that Lillian Webb acted alone, in making that happen, especially when you think that Donald Eugene Webb was in the house for 19 years. The assassination happened in 1980 that Webb's accused of. He died in 1999 after suffering 2 strokes. There's got to be. It's not out of the question to raise the question as to whether other people knew that he was in the house, and it'll be interesting to see if law enforcement pursues that in any way.
Well, because as we look at the story, if you believe Lillian Webb's story, that he first of all was at the Toby Hospital in Wareham, which is the other hospital you'd go to if you were in New Bedford. You go to Fall River, New Bedford, or Wareham. For a month, no one found him. He's on the FBI's most wanted list. He's on Hawthorne Street, which, as people here in this audience know, Hawthorne Street is the center of the political and civic life of New Bedford. It's where everyone lives.
Yeah.
And he was there for about a decade, and then he moves over to North Dartmouth. So if it means that either people were playing golf and they said they were doing surveillance, I don't know. It's not a good look for the FBI or the state police if they believe her story.
Yeah, right. Big if. And I tend to agree with you. First of all, let's just address a couple things here. Toby Hospital. One of the things to keep in mind is that was just a month after the slaying. There wouldn't have been, most likely at that time in 1980, a huge media push with posters and whatnot. The other thing you got to keep in mind is if Lillian Webb is telling the truth there, and he was under an alias at Toby Hospital, which is very likely. Right. He used aliases all the time. he was severely disfigured. We now know because, and this is graphic. I apologize, but one of his lips was torn off in the struggle with Chief Adams. So, even if there was a picture of him out there, he probably didn't look anything like the picture, that they had, because he was so disfigured in that case. Now, the FBI, it is a bad look. Let's be honest about that. Who deserves a lot of credit is Special Agent Thomas McDonald, who is out of all places, out of the Portland office of the FBI up in Maine. He had been assigned this case a few years ago, and he has been working it nonstop. You and I would not be talking today if it weren't for Special Agent McDonald. He has made it his mission to put this case to bed when it was really, it was in the ninth inning, right? And that's the word Special Agent McDonald said to me in an interview I did with him a year and a half ago. He knew this was the end, and I think he probably felt a lot of pressure. And he didn't crumble under that pressure. He made it happen. No. It is fair to look at the years before that and go, all right, Donald Eugene Webb for 2 decades was right there. And, allegedly the FBI had Lillian Webb under surveillance. He was top 10 most wanted. There was a letter that was allegedly sent to the head of the FBI that could have been penned by Donald Eugene Webb. I mean, he was there. So, I don't think it's a great look for that generation of agents that were working on it.
Now, Tim, I just want to go back to your story of January 2016, which was way ahead of its time, because, of course, at that point, as you point out, you're doing the story, but nobody really thought they were going to find the guy, and it's long before the body was ever found. But in your story from 2016, which is available on the internet for people, and I would encourage them to go to the WPRI.com website and look for it, you point out that it's likely that a character named Frank Latch, who we don't know much about, but may have been down there with him in a company and actually drove him back, because he was, as you point out, severely injured.
Yeah, Frank Latch was, and at that time when I was working on that story, I was very interested in him, because that wasn't an angle that was really covered at all, and his name was coming to the surface, particularly with retired law enforcement who they're a little bit more willing to talk when they're not on the job anymore. And yeah, that was a new element that we had gotten there, that Frank Latch, investigators say, both in Cranston, Warwick, where the car was found. And so they had a hand in part of the investigation, as well as state and federal authorities believed that he was in the car, and probably drove Donald Eugene Webb back, or at the very least, was a passenger in the car, because look, initially, Chris, law enforcement thought that maybe Chief Adams had shot Donald Eugene Webb to the leg, had gotten a round off in the struggle. That is not the case. If Lillian Webb is to be believed, beside the facial injuries, he also had a very gruesome leg break, it actually broke through his skin. And so it would be difficult to drive a car at that point. Frank Latch was believed to be one of Donald Eugene Webb's associates. He has a criminal record, robbery and theft, from when we did the reporting back in January 2016, which fits right in with the crew that Donald Eugene Webb would surround himself with when he was doing jobs up and down the East Coast, and then bringing the loot back to Rhode Island, to Federal Hill, to the New England mob, to Fenstead. What they don't know is if Frank Latch was there at the time of Chief Adams' murder. Indications are, from witnesses I've interviewed and police have interviewed, he was not. They didn't have another, they didn't see another person there. And we should point out, Mr. Latch has never been charged in that murder, or in connection with it in any way. But it is interesting that they think, Donald Eugene Webb had help getting back here now, and it's the pieces are starting to come together as we learn more and more.
So we're speaking with Tim White, the investigative reporter from Channel 12 WPRI. Now, Tim, this is not, of course, your first go-around with the New England Mafia, or people who are associated with it, or people who do robberies on behalf of and in conjunction with the New England Mafia. You wrote an excellent book, and I want to go back to this because your book, The Last Good Heist, the inside story of the biggest single payday in criminal history in the Northeast, is about a Patriarcha Organized Crime Family Associates who did a robbery. Now, the book's fantastic. I recommend it to people. I've read it. It's just really, this is one of those summer reads. You definitely want to pick up The Last Good Heist. But, Tim, one of the things you point out in your January 2016 story is that Donald Webb was a knockaround guy, but then he goes to Walpole. And when he comes out of Walpole State Prison, he's a much more serious, much more educated criminal. He went to college, as those guys say. Talk a little bit about what Walpole's like, what you've learned about Walpole while writing your book on The Last Good Heist with those folks who were very similar in some ways to Donald Webb.
For New England, Walpole is the Harvard University of crime. That is where, as you point out, Donald Eugene Webb, before going into Walpole, he wasn't very good at what he did. He got caught, right? And that's why he was at Walpole.
Right.
When he got out, he was much better. First of all, he had likely had stronger contacts in the underworld. And that was very, particularly at that time, Walpole's very different now. But that was a common thread that I saw in my reporting and the characters that went in and out of Walpole is the ties that they would make, particularly back to Federal Hill and in the New England mob as a whole. A couple of the characters in my book were spent time together at Walpole, right? And they made connections with organized crime figures in Rhode Island, which is how they came to Rhode Island to pull off that heist. And it seems that's also the case with Donald Eugene Webb. He got smart, if you will, after going to Walpole, and he stopped doing dink and dunk jobs in New England. He took the show on the road, and he was a prolific thief. He made a lot of money, not just for himself, but for Federal Hill as well, and an organized crime outfit, I should point out, down in Miami, where he'd either fence the loot through Federal Hill, according to the FBI, or down with a criminal syndicate in Miami when he was down in that area instead of hauling everything back up here. But yeah, that is Walpole is definitely a place where punishment turns into criminal education, particularly at that time.
So, and again, folks, it's The Last Good Heist. I'm telling you, if you're interested in the Donald Webb case, you really should pick up Tim's book because it's a great read, but really you're going to see a lot of interesting tie-ins, although we don't know that there are any definite tie-ins between those gangs. But talk a little bit about Stanley Webb, the former New Bedford police officer, who is the stepson, adopted son of Stanley and Lillian Webb. And he was able to accumulate a massive, it is alleged, video poker operation or video gaming machine operation the entire time Dad was on the run.
Yeah. So what I could talk about, and actually, Chris, I think you probably know a lot more about that than I do. But what I thought was interesting in reviewing the search warrants on this is the Massachusetts State Police detective that was assigned to, or I should say, wrote the affidavit in support of the search warrant. So your listeners understand, you got to convince a judge if you're going to search a home. You can't just knock on the door unless the homeowner lets you in. You have to go with that piece of paper, and it is a judge or a magistrate in this case that signs that piece of paper, and you got to convince the judge. All right, this is the evidence I have, and this is why we have to, circumvent some of that individual civil liberties, and you have to allow me to go in on that house. Now, the trooper, the detective that wrote that affidavit for the judge in the Donald Eugene Webb case is the detective that was working the gaming investigation into Stanley Webb, the former police officer who you say is, as you point out, is accused in that gambling operation. And that's not a coincidence. I saw that name on there and the connection. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Donald Eugene Webb adopted Stanley. He is the son of Stanley Portis. And Stanley Portis was Lillian Webb's first husband who died.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, it was Stanley Portis's ID that Donald Eugene Webb had on him when he got pulled over by Chief Adams in Saxonburg, Pennsylvania in December of 1980.
Correct.
In the struggle with Chief Adams, that ID was lost, and they later found it in the snow with a gun. So there are all kinds of ties that bring it back here, and with the Portis and with Stanley.
You know, what's interesting on that gaming investigation is my sources have told me that they were essentially, not literally, but essentially walking past establishments that had video poker machines just to get to places that they knew had these machines that Stanley Webb had. In other words, it was not a crackdown on video poker machines or video gaming machines. It was a crackdown on Stanley Webb. I have that on very good.
And that's a common tactic. Again, you definitely know more about that investigation, but to apply pressure to a family member to get the goal that you're seeking is a common practice in law enforcement.
Hey, listen, I really appreciate this. We've been speaking with Tim White. Tim, so you have an interview coming up this week. Tell us again about that.
Yeah, so back when we were doing a series of stories, when this was still a cold case, I had interviewed Mary Ann Jones, that is the widow of Chief Adams, and she remarried about 9 years after the murder, which is why she has the last name of Jones. I interviewed her then, and then I'd been in touch with her when they were digging behind the house in North Dartmouth, and I think it was just a lot going on, and she wasn't ready to talk at that moment, and I think we can all understand that. But she's ready to talk again, and she's down in Florida. She does still live in Pennsylvania, but she goes down to Florida where one of her sons lives, and I interviewed her via Skype. And also, much to my surprise, Greg Adams, who is one of Chief Adams' sons, who was only, it's really sad, 8 months old when Chief Adams was gunned down, he happened to be at the house and just sort of slid in front of the screen while I was Skyping with Mary Ann, and I had a nice talk with him as well. So that we're going to air that interview, Chris, Thursday in two parts, because Greg decided to join in on the conversation. We decided to get two stories out of it. So the first one is at 5 o'clock, and the second one is at 6 on Channel 12.
Hey, great. Tim, I'll let you go, but thanks again for joining us. Again, we've been speaking with Tim White from WPRI, Channel 12, who's the author of The Last Good Heist, which I can't recommend enough. Thanks again, Tim, for spending some time with us here on Sunday Brunch.
Chris, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching. And if you would like to get more videos like this, please hit the subscribe button below on the WBSM channel. Subscribe to WBSM, and that way you'll always get the latest videos here from Sunday Brunch and the other wonderful programs on WBSM.